Hey there. Thanks so much for tuning in. My name is Devin Littlefield, and I'm managing partner at MarkAdvantage. Recently I gave a webinar presentation on the Google Page Experience Update and just really what that fully means. Unfortunately, the recording was actually bad, so that didn't end up coming through. So I thought I would just take a few minutes to share what that Page Experience Update is, what it means, and just run through the details of that presentation. So without further ado, let's jump on over. All right. So this is a copy of the presentation that I gave earlier last month. And just so you all are aware, there is obviously a update that's coming through called the Page Experience Update. Now, what does that mean? What is that? So in March of 2020, Google announced that they were going to be adding into the algorithm a couple new measurements of how websites are actually, what kind of experience they create for users. And what they did was essentially evaluated these three core web vitals, or what they're called: cumulative layout shift, first input delay, and largest contentful paint. What makes this particularly interesting is that this is the very first time that Google has ever actually looked at website page experience related metrics as part of a measurement within their search algorithm. They have thousands of signals that they look at as part of this, and typically they've always just been related to, is your website secure? Is it, is it serving good content, right? Is it optimized? Are the keywords rich in the content? Normal quote unquote SEO things. But now what they're doing is they're taking a look at the actual metrics behind their page experience. And I think that's pretty huge. This is the first time that they've ever done that, and it'll be interesting to see what ends up shaking out from it. But without further ado, I did want to dive into what those core web vitals mean, and then I'll talk a little bit at the end about what you can do to actually measure those, as well as then be able to take action on them. And so the first one, of course, is your largest contentful paint. What that is, it is the measure of time it takes to load the largest portion of the website painting process in the viewport. And in the viewport part is important. What we're not looking at here is the entire time that it takes to load the whole page. That would be referred to as your full load time. This is specifically looking at within the viewport, right? So what's the very first, kind of the biggest part of the paint that somebody's going to see when they're trying to load it on their device, whether it's mobile or whether it's desktop. That's what they're measuring. And that is a metric, a time measurement. According to Google, it's looking at the load time of that LCP. Good is anything under 2.5 seconds. Needs improvements is somewhere between 2.5 to 4, and then poor is 4 and greater. What's particularly interesting about this metric is that this is absolutely obviously a speed related metric. And this is going to be kind of an interesting one to look at over time. I suspect Google has tons of data that they well know that people will drop off your website if it takes too long to load. And the largest contentful paint, in their words, not mine, is that the LCP is one of the biggest influencers in determining whether somebody will leave a website or not. So to them, this is a really important metric. I suspect we'll have more metrics in the future that will be related to load times. But for now, this is probably the most important to be looking at. And the way to think about LCP, or how it's measured, is, let's say you have this hypothetical box or this window for a load. You see that the logo, the nav bar loads first, and then several seconds later, the main content loads within that window. Right, so that's a hypothetical load, let's say. The first thing that loaded up in that window was your logo, the nav bar, the call to action button, right? So that's what's referred to as your first contentful paint, or your FCP. The largest contentful paint in this scenario is actually your image, because it's taking up the largest amount of space within your viewport. The online webinar and the sign up, the box that would kind of be bounded within, is not the largest. The largest thing goes to the actual image itself. And then, so your largest contentful paint, just in this little hypothetical scenario that I ran through, was 9 seconds, right? Which would be considered poor. The next thing that they also are going to be looking at is what's called the first input delay. And the first input delay is the measure of time a user can first input a selection, like tapping on a link, clicking on the menu, to the time the website can actually respond with that event. And for a lot of people, like I said, that is tapping on a link, clicking on the menu, and that is measured also by time, but particularly the time in between the input and the actual realized response. 100 milliseconds is considered good. 300 milliseconds, anything greater than 300 is poor. And so what does that functionally mean? I know that may seem kind of like a minute thing, like, 100 milliseconds, or even 300 milliseconds, that's really not a lot of time. But for a user, it is. And what it has to do is with the way websites actually load. So when we look at a hypothetical graph or a waterfall graph of how something would load, you can see that the gray boxes on the screen represent network requests, and the blue boxes kind of represent the main thread task, we'll call it. And you can see that there are little gaps in between them, some varying in distance of time. Of course, going from left to right, your x-axis is representative of time. So when you're looking at this, let's say that the styles loaded and the browser can paint content at that hypothetical marker, the second main thread task, at the end of the second main thread task. So that is what we would assume would be the first contentful paints. The main thread task is idle for 5 seconds after all of your main thread tasks have completed. And so from the very first moment that the site is loading to the time that your main thread task is completed, that is referred to as your time to interactive, or TTI. Then within there, you have that big main thread task that's taking place. And in this hypothetical scenario, that's where a user would then actually tap something, right? Or in this hypothetical scenario, right, they tap the link, they click on the menu, they try to do something, but the browser and the site itself is trying to load, right? It's right in the middle of that biggest task. And it can't actually, in this scenario, it can't actually respond until that main thread task is completed, right? So that's when it can first respond. It's that time in between the input and when the actual browser can respond with the task. That's what's referred to as your first input delay. The final core web metric here is your cumulative layout shift. And what this is, it's the total amount of layout shift on any visual element during the lifespan of the page. The lifespan of the page, of course, being the big one. What it's effectively saying is there content that's shifting down or sideways at any point during the page load? A 0.1 is a good score, and a 0.25 is a poor score, with anything in the middle needing improvement. What this is referring to is a calculus of what the actual what content is actually moving within the viewport and by how much. And that's where you kind of get this metric of 0.1 to 0.25. And the way to actually measure this is, let's say you have all the content that loads. There's our beautiful web page again. But then somebody in the marketing department decides, we need to put up a beautiful alert banner at the top of the page. So boom, in comes that alert banner. Click me because I'm important, right? What you just noticed, or what you just observed, is that all of the page content just shifted down a little bit. So the way in which Google measures that is what's called the distance fraction. So how far, the new content that came in, what is the total distance of that in pixels that was measured? And then it's looking at the impact fraction. So then the entire viewport looking at, how far did that actually shift? And that calculus is your impact fraction times your distance fraction. That's how you end up with a CLS. Don't worry, you don't have to do math on the fly. Google has pretty comprehensive reporting on the CLS in particular and can show you that calculus. But for most people, it's going to be fairly obvious. It's usually some type of alert banner or alert ribbon like the one that you see here that causes the score or causes CLS to be an issue, typically. And so just for some real world metrics behind it, not to put scariness into the mix, but certainly even the big players are not perfect. Apple suffering from a little bit of a first Contentful paint issue in reality. Same for Microsoft. CNBC is actually quite good in that first Contentful paint and the largest Contentful paint. But you'll see, again, I call this out to show that even the biggest companies in the world that have the most amount of developers do not get this right. And so it's important to keep that in mind too. I think this is going to be an evolution over time in terms of these metrics and how they're being measured. So ultimately, why does this all matter? It matters because when you look at the stats, 80%, there's an 80% likelihood that a user will leave the web page or the site if it doesn't load within 5 seconds, which is crazy. I've seen stats suggesting is 70% within 3. So obviously there's a vested interest in making sure that your web page and your website loads quickly. The other thing is that there's a 123% probability of a bounce on the website if it takes longer than 10 seconds to load, particularly on mobile devices, compared to a 1 second load time. Big difference. Google is all about creating a great user experience and ultimately making sure that people are coming back to Google to find the good results that they want. That's why Google will do their best to make sure that they surface only the best results. So, and ultimately, why is it all important? I mean, we think it is particularly, and the core recommendations here: review your current performance. You can do this by, simply installing the free Google Search Console onto your website, and they will automatically just process your website against the core web vitals, and they'll tell you what your scores are for every page on your website, what the score is. Obviously, the metrics are measured on a page-by-page basis, and they will provide the recommendations on how to actually go about making the updates. Showcasing the importance, I think this is a big thing, especially if you or the person that you're working for is the manager, boss, owner, whatever. You do want to make sure that it's understood that this is what I believe to be just the start of many more metrics and measurements from Google that will directly be viewing the web experience, right? The speed. These are, like I iterated before, these are the first metrics that Google is ever releasing as part of an algorithm update that will look at the speed, interactivity, the load times, right? Your layout shifting and stability. I think it's going to become increasingly important over the next several years. We'll see Google evolve these stats even further. And so this is really just the beginning of what I would assume to be the iceberg tipping over. So it's important to be thinking about riding that now and getting away from that iceberg before it fully tips. And then, of course, it goes without saying, making those necessary updates, whatever are recommended. Unfortunately, I do not have specific recommendations because it's on a per site basis. It entirely depends on the hosting provider, what content management system you're managing the website from, the theme that's being used. There's thousands of variables involved. So the biggest recommendation I have is just make sure you're reviewing your performance, and then most of the reporting outside of Google Search Console will tell you what you need to be improving. And so that's it. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope that was helpful. If you have any other questions about this page experience update that's rolling out right now, don't hesitate to reach out. Again, it's Devin at MarkAdvantage, and you can reach me, Devin at MarkAdvantage.com. Thanks so much, and have a good day.